All right, welcome everyone. We'll go ahead and get started so we can be sure to end on time as well. We just want to welcome you and thank you so much for joining us today for another installment of the Research Webinar Series hosted by our team here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of MVU, or the Michigan Virtual University, a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU also provides student learning services for K-12 students through the Michigan Virtual School, as well as professional development opportunities in blended and online learning through its Professional Learning Services division. Just a quick disclaimer before we get started that this webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during this webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute and are not given nor endorsed by MVU/MVLRI unless otherwise specified. Today, we are happy to host Mark Stevens and Mary Rice. Mark Stevens is a teacher with 23 years of experience and is currently helping students investigate U.S. history at a large middle school and a large public school district in the Mid-Atlantic. He is also a PhD candidate in learning technology design research at George Mason University. His research interests focus on blended learning and secondary education environments, particularly that used with ELL students. Mary is a research faculty member at the Center for Research on Learning at the University of Kansas. She is also an incoming assistant professor of literacy at the University of New Mexico. Her work focuses on how educators engage with technological literacies to make curriculum that supports diverse students. Mary is a fellow at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, where she participates in research on standards development, pedagogical thinking for online courses, and curriculum accessibility. She is a collaborator in the International Scholarly Association on Teachers and Teaching, where she works on problems of teacher education in settings of low technological infrastructure. With that, I want to turn it over to our presenters, and thank you very much.
So we do thank you guys for attending today. So give us a short little sharing session, and we are going to try to make it not be too long, to the point and such like that. Mary, do you have any welcoming statements?
Well, I'm just really glad to see everybody here today. And it's really good to be working with Mark. So this is based on work that we did together in his classroom. We're very, very pleased to present.
So we became interested in this topic because it grew out of our mutual interest in how a blended learning classroom in the middle level setting might work. We know there's more and more research coming out all the time on this, but the discussions we had along this topic led us to recognize the relevance of viewing what was happening through the community of inquiry framework, which originated in a totally online environment, but it seems to be coming to be applied more in the blended approach as well. And I think the more that we reflected on how it appears in the blended classrooms, the more appropriate it seemed to be using that as our main lens for analysis. So basically, how did we come to this? For me, various aspects of this, and one of them being, as you can see there, Joe Maxwell's statements about the conceptual framework moves past the literature and you don't ignore your own experience. So the next 5 slides or so is going to be a little bit more detail of how my several years ago experiences in speculative thinking and the pilot-like work going back 8 to 9 years kind of impacted this research that Mary and I did. So, as Justin mentioned, I have been teaching for 23 years. So long ago that when I first started this kind of work with technology-enhanced learning, blended learning, it was a 2600 baud modem that came into the school, and it could be sent to one of 6 rooms, and we had to submit an actual presentation request for a 5200 baud modem. So that kind of dates me, but it shows you some of the experience that I may have had that's relevant to my interest in this. The speculative thinking. Born out over the years, the technology advanced, made blended learning possible. And you can see some of the things here that I began thinking about. Why were the only students in my classes that were failing the state standardized test in history, the emergent bilingual, the ELL ones? And so as more and more technology became available, it began to appear that perhaps some of the things that could be combined and done would make this more possible as far as serving these students. I mean, these students in this school where this research was done, where it's a total population of almost 1,700 students, 33% of whom are English language learners, 48% are Latino, Latina, and 66% receive the free and reduced lunch support. Those things together point out some of the things that do challenge students in understanding what they're reading. And I'm not saying that all these students, as you see some of the graffiti in these images, are gang active, but they are impacted, at least in this area, by some of those issues. So the pilot exploratory aspect of this goes back to some of the work that I did before I even met Mary, which provided some of the reflection that led us to choose the examples that we did write about in the research. Going back, like you see there, back to 2008, 2009, again, kind of repeating some of what I just mentioned, I thought to make a multimodal content support tool before I even knew what multimodal was as far as a learning research sense. And it took a while to find the HTML coding that would be simple enough to use and the LMS that would hold it in a flexible way. But eventually that became possible, and I was able to gather in a very, very basic, non-formal way some research that did reflect on the influence of this. And as you can see there were some positive effects. We call these things reading support wikis because that was the main thing I was trying to do for these students, was support their reading ability. And the most interesting thing that struck me with all these results was in the first year that we used these, in almost all of the 16 history units we teach in 7th grade history at that time, there were 3 students who were duly identified as both English language learners and special education. And those students passed the state standardized test that year. Even though the two that I do recall most directly were level 3, WIDA level 3 English language learners. So for them to be able to work with the support that we gave them in that more basic sense than what the research that we reflected on, was encouraging and gave food for thought. Now the current format of this intervention, multimodal, recordings of the text that they're reading, Spanish translations, and again, the reason that I focus more on Spanish translations linked into the text is because 75% of all ELLs, and even more of that in our school, are Latino, Latina, and completion of activity documents that helps them track through the modules, and use of a personal reflection journal. Those are some of the aspects that provided data for Mary and I to reflect on as we went through, the processing of these stories. Item A is pretty much
those are
set.
the technical parts, and then also you have
Yeah.
face-to-face.
Yeah. I mean, the face-to-face things, as we just talked about, are pretty much set, but the face-to-face components, as you can see, item A is pretty much set, but it can be used in differentiated ways, which is where the whole idea of the teaching and the social presence starts to come more into play. And item B and C may require a keen sense of observation and a willingness to make change on the fly using your teaching presence as it's needed.
So for me, I was come to this project from a variety of places. So that right there in the corner is an image of me where sitting in a box from computer equipment that I just got in my school. So that's about 2009 when I was still teaching. So I taught junior high and mostly, and then I also did ran migrant summer school programs within my district and placed teachers and gave them experience and things like that. So I taught ESL. I also taught English language arts. I did general ed and on both honors. And I had written grants for a long, long time to try and get computers and other kinds of technology into my room. And finally things started happening for me. Like I said, in about 2009, we got all this stuff and we unpacked it and so I'm sitting in the box. I think it's fun, sort of as a picture of a relic, to think about how big that stuff still was in 2009 that they were putting into schools. But what we did with those is my students and I stayed after school and we pushed each other up and down the hall, sort of had our own version of a cardboard Iditarod, and it was very fun. And I think I put this in here to talk about because we are interested in presence and in thinking about teachers and students having relationships with each other and how those relationships operate, and also seeing teachers and students as like real people as well. So it's sort of a moment like that for me, and I think you can hear some of the bells in the background that are from Mark's class, right? So those are from your school because class is changing over and things are going on even as you're in here in this moment with us.
In
So,
the interest,
um, oh yes,
I was just going to branch off of what you said, which is the interesting thing is the teaching presence you build up in the classroom can help you out there in the hallway at class change time. So there's like a connection, a many layered connection to these whole ideas of presence you choose to develop.
yeah. Well, and I think we talk about this a little bit later, but teachers and students have always had to develop relationships, and they've always had to figure out how to learn to live with each other in in-person spaces. And there's been Carol Rogers has written a lot about presence, and I think originally there's a lot of connections with the work of John Dewey in 1938 and all of these things. And so then the question is, how do you sort of preserve the pieces of that are important in the traditional environment, and then also move those into places where you also interact with the students in cyberspace. And so that's what I was coming to this project with, was sort of an understanding of, like, I had been a teacher, I had been a teacher researcher, I had an interest in teacher identity work and conceptualizing literacies and technologies, and I also have responsibilities as a scholar to prepare other teachers to do this kind of work, and it was within those places that Mark and I came together.
Oh, went too far. We're not going to get too far into the deep weeds on the literature here. We just wanted you to know that we were indeed guided by some specific things, as you see there, the 4 basic elements, many of them interrelated. We just want to let you know where we're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
The basic mindset, the 2 ideas of self-directed and student-centered really are more engaging for students, we found, as we reflected, and they do indeed help describe the approach that we tried to share in this article. Problem is, it seems that teachers do not like what almost seems to be a paradigm shift in their practice as they're moving from the more teacher-centric, non-blended approach to the more student-centered blended approach. And again, the community of inquiry elements. The idea of learning, as Mary was just talking about, being a social process is one that can be so obvious that sometimes we do underestimate its importance. And with this ever-evolving world of online interaction, the social aspect of learning, even when we do it in a blended fashion, takes on even greater meaning. I mean, I guess one more recent example than what we wrote about is if a student of mine happens to be absent, you ask their friends, do you have their cell phone number, and tell them to text them and make sure they understand what it is we're supposed to be doing, what they're missing, which if you hadn't already built up that type of teaching presence with them, I don't know how they would take that. So it's like a multifaceted in different times and different spaces type of concept.
Yeah, because you're not used to having that kind of interaction with your teacher outside of the classroom. So so in a way, blended learning or highly or technologically supported learning in its various forms allows teachers to be people in ways, potentially allows teachers to be people in ways that they have never been before. They've always been sort of the Plutarchian person up on the mountaintop that you couldn't touch.
Mm-hmm. So again, community of inquiry, basic elements. The key understanding we felt that was relevant to what we were doing from this literature was about the manifestation of the presence is how they overlapped. And again, that's something that's almost so obvious that it's like, why even mention it? But teacher using social presence developed in class and online to successfully exert the presence necessary to redirect students' cognitive presence on the fly, like we shared in the boy who smiled too much, as part of this article that we're talking about. If you haven't already built up that teaching presence through the judicious use of social presence, I'm not sure how the students would receive that.
Yes, and that's maybe one of the things that's different about teaching in a K-12 setting versus teaching in higher ed is that these students who are 11 years old, 11 and 12, maybe some of them 13 at the middle level, so already have other complications in their development that adults don't have. So Randy just pointed out, talking about piling children with shifting hormones in a classroom, for many, many hours or in a school all day long, that's a consideration that has to be taken care of and thought about by teachers, as an
And like you
aspect
said,
of
their
like helping
developmental
them
stage is what
learn
they're
to
thinking.
regulate those things. Yeah,
I mean,
as
I had a
well
class.
as their ability to think about cognitive issues because they're developing cognitive complexity, but they're not adults.
No, no, they're not. And they have the opinion that adults need to pay attention to what they say, but they don't necessarily need to pay attention to adults. So you got to keep these things in mind as you're developing these presences with them. All right. Relevance of community of inquiry to blended learning. You can see there's some bullet points there, but the main thing that we wanted to touch on that was relevant to our research was it gives teachers a framework that they can flexibly use, not just as they interact with the students in learning, but as they design the learning. Because if you design your learning with the community of inquiry elements in a blended environment, it can work more efficiently. Allows you to differentiate and prepare for the future differentiation that you might need, again, as need for change is indicated.
Yes, and then also thinking about the community of inquiry and whether you're building that online or whether you're building that in a traditional environment or whether you're trying to build those both simultaneously, since the students are working in class on the computers either face to face with you, as well. So you're sharing the same physical space, and then they go and do work on their own apart from you in cyberspace. And then they also, like, my students used to follow me around the grocery store. You also face-to-face experiences with kids outside of the academic setting.
Mm. And the basic thing about blended learning research, we didn't focus on that too much, was the two elements you see there. The ability to allow the personalization and the collaboration. Now that might seem understood, but again, a teacher using their teaching presence can design the opportunities and be open to watching students decide on their own, kind of like in the story of the emoji story of Erica, Estefani, and Roxy that's part of this article, where they kind of designed some of the interaction and they exhibited the desire to do it on their own.
Yep. So, and yes, this is much more complicated, like I said, than just using computers in a classroom or having students work fully online. That there are all of these dimensions that are constantly operating. As a teacher, you
Which
have
is
multiple
one of the
places where you got to keep bringing together social and cognitive presence.
and building these understandings is one of the key challenges for all of you who are involved in teacher education, specifically related to blended learning, is helping teachers understand the true nature of blended learning. So here we are in the methodology, which follow that narrative approach, analyzing the interactions that Mary and I had with each other and that I had with my students.
Yeah, so we decided that we wanted to use a narrative inquiry approach because what we were really interested in was sort of mapping or thinking closely about the interrelated stories in a grand sense that go on in classroom life. And so, and it's not a methodology that's often used in classroom research that is has been aimed at these community of inquiry and these different kinds of presences, because mostly in the literature, people have been kind of trying to operationalize so what cognitive presence means and what the features of it are. And what we did was we went back to the Deweyan experiential roots of the educational experience, and we were interested more in sort of digging into what those are and how those play out and what that really looks like in a classroom, because there's so little work in the blended setting, particularly for K-12 and especially for middle level learners. So there are 10 million middle level learners in the United States right now. There is very little research that specifically addresses or thinks about those populations. And so the way that we framed out the narrative inquiry was a series of narrative episodes that underwent the narrative inquiry processes this is typical in the methodology of burrowing, broadening, and retelling. And so in burrowing, then we had to go through and look at, so what is presence, how do we conceptualize it, how do we think that it operates for students, broadening, thinking about blended learning in general and how that research is operated in other places, and then also storing and restoring, where we have these ideas in our head and we have what's called personal practical knowledge of blended learning and teaching. So we've gone in with and worked with these students, and we have our knowledge of teaching is bottled or bound up in the stories that we have about the students that we've worked with. And it was really a matter of noticing those stories as they occurred throughout this research process and unpacking the stories that we had from other interactions that we'd had before we had done this research, and then sort of interfacing them together. So, because Mark and I have been talking for a long time, we've been working together, sort of at least informally, since about 2014. And I knew a lot of things about his teaching, and I had known a lot of things about his students and the kind of work that he did, and also the sort of the trajectory of his career. And then it's a matter of like capturing those and asking questions against them. And this is different than just narrative analysis, where I would, where in that kind of methodology, I just ask Mark a bunch of questions about his, tell me a story about where you thought you were really successful as a blended teacher, or tell me a story about a really hard day. And then I went through and looked for themes. So this is really more about a constellation or a pattern that reveals this larger image or phenomenon on a school landscape. And I like this metaphor of a constellation from Cheryl Craig, because it really does kind of get the hint at this picture. So, for example, the W down towards the bottom of the page on this constellation picture is Cassiopeia, who is a queen. And so you have more than one star, right, being connected up and given some kind of cultural meaning by people. And if it resonates, so if it makes sense to people year after year after year after year after year, then that is a way to codify cultural knowledge, or to think about how to engage with those, and with the sky, right? With what's really kind of a messy soup of a bunch of bowls of gas and light. And another one is the Big Dipper. So you can see over there on the left side, the Big Dipper is the Big Dipper to a lot of us, but another cultural group may connect those stars in a totally different way. And so, what we were really trying to do is think about the constellation patterns that were emerging in what we were doing with kids, so that we could really show the work that goes into creating different kinds of presence in a blended learning environment. So, and that required a lot of like these narrative touchstones, and one of them was the narrative beginnings, where we talked about how we came into the research and what our purposes were, and we tried to model that a little bit for you today. And also, we could have just done this webinar where you could hear our voices, but instead we put ourselves on the video, because I wanted you to be able to see Mark's classroom behind him, and I wanted you to be able to hear the bells. And I'm over here in my office in Kansas, and so you can see me and see who I am, and as a way to think about positionality and subjectivity in in the research. So, also in a narrative inquiry, there's a three-dimensional space, and it makes kind of a box like this. So you have the temporal happenings, where things happen across time. You have a sociality dimension, where you have to engage with the prior research, and then there's this place-based stuff, where we have to document scenes as being important to our inquiry, this is a specific kind of school. So this is not like my classroom, where I was teaching in rural Utah. This is an entirely, even though we were teaching kids that were approximately the same grade, and I had students from a lot of the same countries that Mark has students from, and this is a completely different kind of space. And the children notice this too, and they engage in that as well. So Mark's students are all in other places right now, so he can do this webinar. And some of them just really wanted to go to some other teacher's classroom, and some of them didn't, because to them, this is their space and this is their time to work, even though technically they should be able to just take their computer and work anywhere, right?
Well,
So,
and that
so
that extends to outside the classroom, the school as well, where some of them can indeed go to work at the library or whether in this area, the whole social aspect, it's not safe for them to go to the library by themselves. So this whole idea of making this possible in this blended environment within the school, is important,
mhm.
using those
Yes, and
presences.
also to sort of I think engage in the conversation about what blended learning is as a model, and how there's been a lot of discussion about what models of blended learning really look like and what the features are in order to qualify as a specific kind of blended learning. But when you get in and you're actually trying to work with kids, then you knock something together that works for your context. And and you
Yeah.
can't let people come in and be like, well, Heather Staker said this, and so you have to do this. That there really is this element where, even though you're doing blended learning, and even though, from an administrative perspective, people hope that you can um, standardize things, we have to resist that, because that's sort of my point earlier about making the kids eat at 10:35. So this is not about what works for us. This is about what works for kids and their context and what they want to do. So we did our best to, although it was easier to explain research, to try and talk about some major principles or ideas that came into our work. We didn't undergo a targeted kind of coding process, but instead what we did was we fashioned narrative accounts that we thought were resonant. So we fashioned narrative accounts that demonstrated this constellation pattern right here, so that you could see um, how these interactions in this class typically goes. So Mark made this slide about the process where we're telling the stories, we're recording them, we're thinking about how they're connected to other stories, and those stories can be things that actually happen within the classroom, but also institutional narratives about what blended learning is supposed to be like, and also community narratives too about whether the community is safe or unsafe, and for whom. So thinking about how the stories might impact what happened over the next day, month, or longer. So if this happens in class today, what are the reverberations? What can we foresee? And then redrafting those stories to include those impressions and connections, and then adding our notes to stories that we found were connected. Because we can't just turn in a 60-page chronicle of everything
Hmm.
that we experienced together during the research. We have to find a way to depict the phenomenon of uh, engaging in teacher presence, and engaging students in various kinds of presence as they worked in this middle level classroom, in this setting, in the blended learning context. So, and obviously then that required a fairly flexible approach for data gathering. And because this is Mark's classroom, so he led this research and um, discussed it with me, and then we moved forward from there. So the discussions that we had were very informal. So Clendenin and Kane and Vera Kane talked about preserving the intimacy and the relational concerns that directed the narrative inquiry. So, because Mark's telling me stuff about his class that and showing me his students, and then that makes him vulnerable. So he's now in a position for me to be like, well, Mark is a blended learning teacher, but he's not following this certain model, or his kids, certain number of his kids still didn't pass,
Hmm.
or his kids misbehaved, they spilled a glass of water, and so he must not be a very good teacher, or this must not be a very good school. And instead of putting myself in the position of the researcher as somebody who's sitting up there to judge what Mark's doing, then it was much more important for us to have as unilateral or as a lateral interactions as possible, where people can just be honest, and there's not this sense of like him trying to demonstrate to me that something about his school or something about his community. And when
And
you can get to those places, then that's where you start getting, I think, the more trustworthy findings from the research. Even though, like I said, we didn't do this really complicated coding process, and we weren't trying to operationalize some aspect of community inquiry or presence.
the frequency of the discussions and the combination of formal but yet informal nature, and making them not be overwhelmingly long, I think helped us to realize more of what we were observing.
Mm-hmm. And so, as we crafted the research texts and the article began to emerge, we have an introduction, we have 2 episodes, and we have a coda, which we presented as findings. And then we did this to sort of help understand the story and let us look back at those issues of presence. So let's see. We have these two stories that we looked at. The Power of Emoji is one, and then The Boy Who Smiled Too Much. And they are on at face value. If we told them separately, they would stand alone, but they're actually linked, and the way that we linked them gave us insights about what presence really was and how it would operate.
And they're linked with elements of similarity also, and similarity as in the combination of on and online support and the waxing and the waning results of what I was doing with them. But they're also linked by the differences. Collaboration, yes, but one of them was one-on-one collaboration, and one of them involved collaboration, a team of 3. One of them involved a student agreeing to be a mentor to another. So those elements, did serve to make them that constellation instead of just as separate stories. The thing I like about that story, go back one slide.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at those images, you see, no, the one with,
oh, okay.
That one.
The teacher and the student.
Yeah. I just wanted to mention that briefly because if you look at it, you can see presence. You can see the teaching presence. You can see teaching presence that's online, and you can see teaching presence that's face-to-face, or or truly blended, as in you're using the online presence of the teacher to direct the student, the face-to-face presence to direct the student online.
Yeah, and really sometimes you're doing one and sometimes you're doing the other, and you've got to figure out how to move back and forth along those dimensions.
Mm-hmm. So this is another example of the waxing and the waning, the power of the emoji with Erica, Estefani, and Roxy, where they were definitely struggling to engage in self-directed learning activity that they needed to do in this module-based approach that was being used so that they could keep somewhere near the expected pace. And as you see here, the bullet notes, we gave them various supports such as note guides, basic note guides with more content loaded on, directions, and then it came down to allowing them to work together. And all of these things worked a bit, but then again, the effectiveness would wane. And then started to using the emojis that would be placed on the documents, and they seemed to enjoy that. But even that, like all things used in an instructional environment, eventually the effect begins to wane.
Yeah. So, and I actually like the way Mark wrote "no funcionó," which is the Spanish word for it doesn't work or it doesn't function. And that's different because he also could have put "no sirvió," so it doesn't serve or it doesn't accomplish the purpose. And he could have put "no trabajo," which is like it doesn't work, like it doesn't get stuff done. And so there's lots of strategy in the choices that he uses in order to express what he thinks is going on in the environment, and it's those kinds of things that would come up in conversation about, oh, well, that's an interesting sort of interpretation of that phenomenon, or something like that, much more than if we had just gone through and coded and said, well, it seemed to work well when you used emojis with the kids, so let's recommend everybody do that. And instead, we wanted to show how there's more complexity to a solution or a best practice than it really looks like.
And again, the boy who smiled too much. Again, strategies worked, and then they didn't. Private conferences, you think you have an agreement, and then right away you see somebody off track in one way or another. You see them off track by noticing something in the face-to-face environment, And you provide support immediately in the online environment. So you're blending those kind of things. Um, and then again, you're using the teaching presence to use the students' senses of social presence, and then you allow one student to mentor the other student. So a teacher not engaged, using their active presence, could miss some of this.
Yes, well, because you would assume that, oh, the student is sitting there looking at their computer, so they must be okay. Or the student doesn't have a browsing history that reflects what you wanted them or you thought you wanted them to do with the modules, and so then they must be, so then they must not be doing something right. And so then you have to decide whether or not the whether or not there's something legitimate going on in the classroom, and then make decisions about how to come forward from that. And you don't, as a teacher, you have to make huge amounts of decisions, and you have very little information to go on. And what happens is in blended learning, or when we're engaging with these computers and these devices, is it gives us all kinds of opportunity for more data. But the question that we pondered as we moved through the study is, um, like how teachers, on whether teachers could legitimately use data from all the sources, and the recognition that even though there's lots of this data out there, and even though we know all their browsing history and we can tell how many times they clicked on whatever kind of website, that you still have to use teacher judgment, no matter how much data you have. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, in a lot of ways, you have to use greater judgment than before.
And some of those things that Mary's just talking about came out in some of these parts of the coda that weren't included in the two main stories, such as the example you see here. And you stop and you think, if I didn't already have some type of teaching presence data of having observed this girl, and when I pulled and looked at her browsing history and saw how much she had been going to this one spot on Google Maps, um, I might have reacted differently. But then when you stop and you use your teaching presence to engage in a social interaction with the student based on what you'd already previously built up with them, and let her explain, oh, she's just going to look at the town in Bolivia where she's from. But she controlled herself using the self-regulation to not do it until after the content time was done. So again, using that social
So,
presence and knowing how and when to interact.
well, and actually, that was an opportunity then for her to be self-expressive too. Like,
Yeah,
oh, this
exactly.
is where I'm from. This is the way to use technology to feel connected to a particular kind of space. And it would have been really tragic
Hmm.
to let those pressures that you feel as a teacher, um, like, force you to monitor kids in ways where they learn that they can't be who they are, right? Where they lose the intersubjectivity or the desire for it that actually you're trying to foster in a community of inquiry.
And then this other part of the code, the story of, we'll call them Diego, and Samuel, who one year they actively worked to disrupt. So you're able to use your teaching presence to recognize that perhaps trying to work with them in a strictly content acquisition way is maybe not the best. So again, thoughtfully using those concepts of presence and the flexibility that blended learning does enable to help them when they might be thinking more about the people they're going to have to go meet with their group after school. So again, using enough of the teaching presence to recognize these things. Sometimes there's
Yes,
something behind the
and
disruption.
mm-hmm. Well, teaching kids about how to engage with a chronotope, right? Where obviously we don't get to do whatever we want whenever we want it, but that you do have the opportunity to use technology in order to give yourself some flexibility. You just have to, people just have to think about how they want to be strategic and plan rather than just sort of expecting that because there's not a deadline or because we can do this online that everything will just come together without any planning whatsoever. So, because that's not true. So we
Yeah.
have about 2 minutes, and so I was thinking we would just
Yeah.
go. We talk about
The
some
implications are
implications,
a
and
lot
then
more
we would
relevant to
talk
the
with
people.
the. Mhm.
Yeah. The practice implications, we've kind of been talking about those, so we don't want to dwell on these too much. But again, it's thoughtfully thinking about using them.
Mhm. Yes, and then also thinking about, remember, if teachers are really going to assert that presence and if they're going to be people who foster intersubjectivity in classroom settings, then they've got to find ways to where this brings them joy and they're not just like computer monitors or they're not just
Mm-hmm.
people who are out to make sure that kids are using websites the way that we want them to and all these things that this is actually intellectually engaging and stimulating for them. So, and also thinking about um, more research in terms of making connections between the learner support, the presence, and the building of communities in K-12 settings, and then confronting those issues about student disengagement or even disenchantment for using the web-based curriculum for a lot of their instruction. So one of my favorite stories to tell is I went and I was working early on in Mark's classroom and I went and asked this child, I said, "What's your favorite thing about this class?" And he says, "Oh, we get to use the computer every day." And I said, "Okay, so what's something that's kind of challenging about this class?" And his face changed and he says, "We have to use the computer every day." I think that really captures how how students conceptualize blended learning and or learning with technological devices, and that they really love them on one end, but um, they also like they're not in and of themselves just learning with a laptop or trying to engage in a blended learning program and make sure that if you have a flipped classroom then you're doing everything that the manual says that a flipped classroom should do, but that you recognize that these are real kids and they get tired and they get sick and they need drinks and they um, want to smile at their friends and all of these other things. In terms of policy implications, so the makers of the local and state policies should consider whether they want technology to merely be used for content presentation, or if you're really trying to help people learn how to have communities of inquiry online. And I think this is especially as important as these children that Mark is teaching are going to go into higher ed context and take a lot of their classes that way. And so, do they know how to do this? And is that really what we want? And then also, do those policymakers desire teachers who manage students, or do they want students who manage their learning? And so then, what the role of the teacher is as they become less responsible for making sure that the kids have a bunch of content knowledge because they can find that on the internet. But like, then what is teacher work now? And then do they want learning environments where student support is oriented toward engagement, or student support oriented towards subject matter competence only? And that's a question not just for blended learning, but I think for online learning in general. Is this really about becoming a whole person, or is this about making sure that you can demonstrate some subject matter competence that satisfies some policy somewhere?
And are those policymakers going to support the development of professional development that will enable the teachers to use these concepts of presence to serve the students? So there you have it.
Well, because it's really easy to push people into efficiency narratives rather than thinking about relational.
So this is where we ask for questions.
Yeah, if anybody has a question and would like to use the microphone, you can let me know in the chat window. I'd be happy to enable the microphone, or you can use the chat window as we've been doing throughout the presentation as well.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a good point. I'm sure Mike would agree too.
Yeah. Well, I've been working on some data that I've gotten about professional development in fully online settings, and you ask teachers where they learn fully online teachers where they learn to teach students, and they say, oh, in professional development. And so then you ask them what they're learning in professional development, and you're not sure how those things that they're focusing on in professional development really are going to support them in working with kids.
Speaking of online teaching, this has reminded me of teaching an online class of students and using both the microphone and the chat window to interact. It's kind of fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Randy made a point about modeling
Yeah,
effective online learning is really a challenge. So,
it is.
um, with, in my work with the Center on Online Learning and Students with Disabilities, one of our initial charges was to find good models, but it's tough. It's a struggle. So, and then because of the ways in which vendor relationships kind of appear in the equation, then there's lots of proprietariness that show up when you're trying to build a model or trying to share a model with teachers. So, whereas you don't, in K-12, you don't always own the stuff that you would like to, it would be helpful to share with teachers who are using
And
those things.
Amy points out a valid goal for future research
Mm-hmm.
about the skills and the knowledge coming from each modality.
Yeah, so what do they learn by being in the physical setting in blended learning, and then what do they learn from using the technology, and how does that carry over between them? It's interesting. So, and Randy talks about flexibility, yet have them engage in social and group learning, as being a pretty big challenge as well. So, because cooperative learning is very helpful, and actually, because of one of my foci on students with disabilities, then one of the things that they are not getting in online learning environments, especially fully online learning environments, is social skills opportunities, and definitely not instruction.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and you would do that normally as a teacher, you do that just as they were working together, and there would be all these authentic opportunities where they would interact, and those possibilities go down, the greater reliance that you have on technology, and then what replaces it, and how do you do it, for whom.
In these days and times, that whole, as Catherine points out, sustainable PD in these days of sometimes shrinking budgets is an issue.
Mm-hmm.
So there has to be
Yes,
that
well, and
dedication
also
from policymakers.
there really does. There has to be people sort of at the state level that really support this stuff, and that rather than, oh, come in and teach my teachers how to be compliant, it's
Mm-hmm.
come in and teach my teachers, how to think and work with kids in creative and interesting ways.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Catherine Kennedy also said, um, gave an amen to the sustainable PD for blended and online learning. And I think her work's shown that people don't even think online or blended teaching is something that's going to happen to them. That schools of higher ed sort of think that's an fully online teaching is an afterthought, but and that's an uphill battle. That's something to kind of to consider. But blended teaching is the hot thing right now. So there's not a state that doesn't have some kind of blended initiative either already going or in the works.
Yeah.
So yes, and so you have to help people who are going to make these decisions and who have access to the funding, understand what the issues really are, because while a lot of them would not dream of putting their own children in inferior educational circumstances, they are not afraid to put people like Mark's students in those circumstances. And so Mark has to be the person who pushes back. So who absorbs the pressure without transferring it to the kids. So,
Which
and
is
how
what
long
led
can
me
he
to what I'm
last?
doing now, to
He's
try to
currently pretty
use some
tough.
of this understanding
Mhm.
to branch out and have a greater effect, hopefully, someday.
Mhm.
Okay, well, we are just about at time, so I encourage the conversation to keep going in the chat window there. I do really want to thank our presenters, Mark and Mary, for joining us today and for engaging us in a really great presentation, interesting work, interesting conversation and discussion being pursued around this stuff as well. So thank you guys again for hosting us today. We really appreciate it, and thanks for the round of applause there from Randy. Just a couple housekeeping items. Just a couple housekeeping items before we wrap up today. A couple MVLRI initiatives that we want to make mention of. We have a podcast that you can find in the iTunes podcast store, the Apple podcast store. You can also check out our guest blogger program if you're interested in writing for us. So if you would like to check out either of these platforms, if you're interested in being a guest or a writer for either of these platforms, check out our URLs that are linked here in the presentation to learn more about either of those initiatives. We also have an upcoming webinar 2 weeks from today on May 31st at 2 p.m. Eastern. We'll be hearing from Dr. Pei Lin and Dr. Susan Lowe's from the Teachers College at Columbia University about one of their recent publications from MVLRI, actually, a couple MVLRI fellows on student learning pathways through online algebra courses. I'm going to link the publication there in case anyone would like to actually read the report as well. So we hope to see you in a couple weeks for that presentation as well. In the meantime, you can keep up with us by emailing us at mvlri@mivu.org. You can sign up for our mailing list by clicking that link there. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn on all of the links that are provided there, or the handles that are provided there. And you can expect the recording of this webinar to be hosted on our YouTube channel within the next day or so. You can find our YouTube channel at youtube.com/MVLRI1. And you can find all of our prior recordings of our webinars at our YouTube channel now as well. And to see any other upcoming webinars, you can visit our website at mvlri.org/presentations/webinars. With that, I will close this up. Thank you all for joining us today, and we hope you have a great rest of your week.